There's only 24 hours in a day. I got a pair of earbuds and I wish there was a way that I could know just what I want to listen to. There's 150,000 shows that I'm not sitting through. When the world is dark and boring, let us do your exploring. Pod on pod. Pod on pod.
Welcome to Pod on Pod, a guide to the world of podcasts because it's not your daddy's radio. We're your hosts.
I'm Josh.
And I'm Joel.
How you doing? What the poppers? What the popanicks? What the popadelics?
What the Papanalians?
Yeah, what the popanalians?
This week on Pod, in case you don't know what that reference is, we're going to be reviewing WTF with Marc Maron. Marc Maron, he's still a comedian, isn't he? I just think of him more of a podcaster now than anything else. He had a brief stint with Air America, the liberal radio station you might remember from several years back. And then when that kind of fell apart, when his traditional radio career fell apart, his back was against the wall, and he's told the story several times on the podcast. He turned that potential audience, that audience that was hanging around there that had showed some interest in him speaking on a regular basis, he turned that into this show, WTF with Marc Maron. I think you know what the acronym stands there for, but you're not allowed to use swear words in the iTunes listing. So I think that's why it's not just called what it actually is.
Maybe.
I don't know. Anyway, you're listening to Pod on Pod. Every week we review a different podcast for you, so it'll make it easier for you to find your new favorite show. There's a tremendous amount of material out there. Shows about everything. Marc Maron kind of started this show, I think, more about the history of comedy, and he interviewed mostly comedians in the beginning, but it's become much more than that as his star has risen, and I think podcasting has risen along with it.
People are using WTF now just like they use Jimmy Fallon or Kimmel or Seth Meyers for late night. Anytime there's something to promote, their agents are contacting Mark to have him on the show.
Yeah, you got to make the rounds. And the rounds are, once you get to podcasting, there's 3 or 4 shows that you want to try to get on. If you're in a certain realm of the entertainment industry or in certain businesses, you want to go talk to Joe Rogan. Maybe you want to do Adam Carolla's show if you're in certain realms, but you definitely want to get on Marc Maron if you can. And what's most interesting about that is it's actually given him access to a whole catalog and category of interviewee that he never would have had access to before. And I'm talking specifically about some of the legends of the broadcasting or performance industries. This guy's talked to, Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks. He most recently talked to Larry King, which kind of blew me away. And Larry was a great interview too. But to me, Marc Maron is the descendant of Larry King almost. He is the modern standard for interviewing. If you want a long-form interview with someone of notoriety in whatever field they're in, and now it's extended to music and actors and artists of different stripe, but also, yes, comedians and performers, Marc Maron's the guy that you want to hear from, I think. The show launched in September of 2009. Primarily, it consists of interviews with comedians, comedy writers. You've got everybody from the entertainment industry and radio communities now as well. The show is produced by Maron's former Air America coworker, Brendan McDonald. And it's really just a little bit of Brendan behind the scenes and Mark on the mic. And it's more than weekly. It's also an explicit podcast. We should say that right off the bat.
In the garage.
It is. Now it's in the garage. The way that we review shows on Pod is we break it down with 4 categories. First of all, we talk about the audio quality. Then we talk about the host likability. We talk about production values and then the content itself. We also play some fun games at the end. And then after all is said and done, we're going to rate the show for you out of 2 possible earbuds each. Other things give it 4 stars maybe, or you give it 2 thumbs up. We give it earbuds in. That's how we do on Pod.
Am I giving it my full attention, or is it just in the background?
If this is your first episode checking us out, then go back and find the archives at podonpod.com. We review a new show for you every week to try to help you find your next favorite podcast. This week, it's WTF with Marc Maron. Let's get straight to it. Audio quality. I think Marc is kind of the gold standard on this.
You are wrong.
Why? You tell me, seriously, he's done this so long, he's got it all figured out.
514 episodes.
Yes, audio quality differs from episode to episode because occasionally he goes on the road and
Right.
records in someone's house.
Right.
Also, occasionally he'll do a live show. He'll have several guests on a panel.
But he also, exactly, and he also records the cold open separately
Yes.
from the actual interview. So one of the last ones I listened to, he was in Joshua Tree, outside, wind was blowing.
Right. So yeah, their audio quality differs from episode to episode, but I'm saying in whatever circumstance he's in, he's got about as good a quality recording from that circumstance as you can hope for on a podcast.
You can't grade something like that. You can't grade a podcast based on circumstantial audio quality. Is it crystal clear every time? No, it's not.
I'm saying it's always listenable, though. I've never, even the first episode, I never heard an episode of WTF and was like, I can't make this out. I'm going to skip it. And almost every other show that I listen to, even the ones that I love that I listen to every episode of, I've heard at least one episode where I'm like that. Even our show, not this one, but our other show, we've got one episode where you and I still go back and the audio quality on that one is not good enough. You know, like that happens. I think that's part of, if you do a podcast long enough, you're going to have some circumstantial problems.
You have to view the podcast as a whole from the beginning to the end. And the cold opens aren't always there. The interviews generally are.
All right, fair enough. Well, let's go to host likability then. Once we can hear him or not, is Mark the kind of guy that you want to spend an hour and a half with on a regular basis?
I don't know if in real life I could spend an hour with a guy, but I do enjoy, I think he is a great interviewer. He gets so much out of his guests, and I think to this point, I think the guests know that going in, so they're already prepared to talk about some deep, dark stuff or some embarrassing stuff or going all the way back to being a kid. Like they kind of, the people who come on the show are fans of the show. They listen to the show. They know how it works.
And not only that, but they're coming on the show to get what the show does for you, which is to bare your soul in a way that's slightly controlled to the audience that you know listens to this show, which is, I think, generally more upscale than the average entertainment purveyor. Generally a little bit more intelligent, more schooled, a little more discerning too, I would say. His audience, this is an upscale audience probably. The fact that you're doing a podcast, we've already talked about this, it already puts you in a certain kind of class. So the people are coming to this audience looking to pitch now because he's got a nice weekly listener base.
Did you just say that podcasts are classy?
This one is, in particular.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, even though that it is an explicit show, like it's risen above. He's developed a pedigree and a reputation, and the people that come to his show, you're right, they understand that, and they're along for the ride.
Right.
Here's the deal. Mark is the kind of guy, I think, that becomes more likable the more time you spend with him.
Yes.
And that's true for a lot of people. A lot of people, you warm up to them over time. But it's in this case, it's not just the perception of you understanding or getting more used to his issues and nuances and peccadillos. It's also a matter of Marc Maron is becoming a better person as this show goes along. Like Mark's working on him.
Well,
you and I have talked about.
He's trying.
He's trying. He is on a search for himself, and he's doing that through other people. I think it's really the most selfish podcast out there in a way, because he's literally going person to person and mining, what is it about you that I can use to help me? You know?
Or you do the thing that I do, why do you do it?
Yes, yeah, he asked that question a lot. Here's a thing that I see in you that I know I have a problem with. Why do you think you do that? And what did you do about it? Did you fix it yet? If so, I want to fix it like you fixed it.
So one of the things that he does so well is he talks and engages in dialogue when it's entertaining and it's going somewhere. And then he knows when to shut up.
Yeah, and let the moment lie.
And only say certain things like, oh, well, where did your mom get that from? Or, leading questions, getting them to continue with the story. He doesn't put too much of himself into it.
I know you're not a guy that goes back and listens to backlogs, and I know you only got into podcasting in the past couple of years.
This is one of the ones I do.
You've gone,
yeah.
And of course, not all of his are available for free. If you subscribe to his app, if you're a premium subscriber or whatever, you got the full backlog, and it's, as you mentioned, 500 and some odd episodes and running.
514.
Yeah, that's a lot, man. That's a tremendous amount of shows. But if you go back and listen to some of the really early episodes, or occasionally around his anniversaries, he re-releases some of the first episodes. Anytime you go back and hear those, the interviews were not as good either. It's not just about Mark becoming a more likable guy or understanding the medium of podcasting and what his audience is looking for better over time. He's gotten better at talking to people too. Early on, there was a whole lot of, hey, I'm counting my time until I can take back the mic. You know?
And he's gotten so good at
There's none of that really anymore. He's when he asks a question, he's asking that leading question, but that's because you didn't say enough the last time. I want you to say more now. Say more.
It's one of the long form style of podcasting that I like.
Well, let's go to something you're probably not going to like about it. What about the production values? This is always your least favorite part of the show.
No,
you want it stripped down.
This is and it is. And it is.
And first of all, he's got a great theme song. The mix of the rock music and some quotes from the show, but also quotes from movies he's been in. I love when he yells "Lock the Gates" from Almost Famous, which, by the way, you know Marc Maron's face now. Of course, he's on TV. He's got a show named Maron. But also, he's been in movies. He's been in a lot of movies through the years, and he's been a working stand-up comic too. He just never had that big break until now.
Before I listened to my first episode of WTF, I didn't have a clue who he was.
I didn't either. It was many, many episodes of WTF before I had any idea who he was, really. And I've put the pieces together, over the years. And then, of course, now in the past, how long has Maron been on the air? Is this the third season? Second season?
Yeah.
All right. So, but still, it's really been about 3 years now since the podcast has really blown up into some mainstream knowledge and acceptance. And then the TV show has taken it even one step further.
I'm like, man, this neurotic guy is getting all these famous people to talk to him in his garage. This is amazing.
I got to start a podcast. So the production values are pretty simple. You got the intro, the outro, and faded music into the interview segment. When he moves from his monologue in the beginning to the interview segment, just a little faded music to show you that there's a difference there. I also think sometimes he makes it easier for people to skip through his monologue.
No. Oh, we'll get into this. We'll get into this later on when we get into content.
All right. Well, let's go there right now. Let's go to the content. First and foremost, I'm a guy that not always, because occasionally I like to check in on him, see how Mark's doing in his life. But most of the time, I don't listen to every episode. I listen to episodes when I either know the guest or am interested more in knowing more about the guest. And I almost always skip the monologue.
I am a person who almost always skips cold opens, monologues to every podcast, except this one. I will listen to the monologue of this podcast and not hear the interview out just to check in, just to see what's going on, just to see where he's at.
Well, and how's
Def Cat doing?
I
want to know.
If you haven't listened to the show before,
has he gotten the drain fixed in the front of his house, or is it still going to flood his garage?
You've got about 15 minutes at the beginning of the show, 12, 15, and sometimes as many as 20 minutes, where it's a combination of some jokes. He writes a little material in there every week, but it's mostly he just checks in with you. He talks a little bit about what he's doing, if he's got shows coming up, what was the frustrating thing in his life this past week, how he's thinking, where's his head at. He used to talk a lot about his girlfriend and his fiance. That's no longer going on.
Well, he was talking about he was dating Moon Zappa.
Really?
Now, yes.
See, this is what I miss. Okay. So Moon came on the show and they talked about the fact that they needed to date.
You're right.
And now they are?
Hey, maybe if you'd keep listening to the monologue, you'd learn some stuff.
Seriously, I feel like I'm so left out now. I'm so happy for him. I really, really hope that works out. They seemed like they had a lot of chemistry.
Oh, I don't think it's working out.
Well, they're both pretty crazy. I think that was also clear. Chemistry doesn't mean compatibility necessarily. What I do listen to the show every week or most every week, the interviews. His interviews, and we've already said it, they are amazing. He really has learned how to draw a human out of their shell or make like a real legend, a Carl Reiner or Mel Brooks, or Larry King even, who was obviously confrontational pretty much the whole interview. Even Larry King offered up bits, little things that I'd never heard in another interview.
Or Carlos Mencia going off the rocker.
Or Gallagher walking out. There's there's a lot of really good moments in this thing.
Or Iggy Pop shows up shirtless.
Like you do. Like you do.
Yeah.
Or sometimes you find a new girlfriend like Moon Zappa. All on the WTF with Marc Maron podcast.
This is a podcast that I generally interview podcasts. I only pick out the people that I'm interested in listening to. This one is the one where I have to listen every week.
And it is because of the little nuggets that he pulls out of somebody. You didn't know that Mr. T had that side to him, but all of a sudden, he's bearing his philosophical core.
Yeah, and
I don't think he's actually had Mr. T on the show, by the way.
No, but there was Drive By Truckers, the guys from Drive By Truckers. I didn't have a clue who they were, didn't know Drive By Truckers at all. But those interviews are so great because they do get into like Muscle Shoals and the history behind it and their recording studios and those kind of things. And it's really cool, man.
It's one of my favorite shows, absolutely, and it is one of the ones I'm subscribed to it. I don't listen to every episode, but pretty much more often than not, it's there. And a lot of times it's also a show that I'll save episodes of. Hey, I don't have time to get to this, but that's one that I know I'm going to want to listen to. And so weeks, months after the fact, you go back and you still get to hear that interview with Vince Vaughn or whoever it might have been.
He did interview Vince Vaughn.
I know. That's one of the ones that I got saved in the show. The most recent episode that I listened to, and it was a great one, Roseanne Cash. Very recent episode talking about her most recent album. Some great stuff in there about her and her marriages and her current issues with like raising a child later in life. Some really, really deep stuff in there.
You know what WTF has a lot in it in its vast library?
What?
Life.
Yeah.
There's a lot of living in those interviews, man.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I'm looking forward to this week's episode, by the way. The Amazing Jonathan. That's going to be a hell of a story.
But see, that's what I was going to tell you. Like, who else interviews Iggy Pop and the Amazing Jonathan and Carl Reiner?
Yeah.
Like, nobody. And well, except Marc Maron. That's the beauty of podcasting, ladies and gentlemen.
I also love his obsession with Saturday Night Live. And whenever he gets one of those guys on and you get to see the audition process and they all have different views of Lorne Michaels.
Well, but it's one of those like woulda, coulda, shoulda. Like he circled the show in lots of different ways, had several times where it almost could have happened for him. It was one of those things that he would have gone on a completely different trajectory if he had ever gotten on the show.
He was almost hired to be the Weekend Update guy.
He would have made a great one, truthfully, and he probably would have been famous 20 years earlier. The problem is, if he had been, this show never would have existed.
You can't say that.
Well, I mean, you gotta look at like the way that he came to it. It was built out of frustration and desperation.
Yep.
Exactly. Which a lot of great art is. One of the things that we like to do on Pod is give shows alternate names. Sometimes the title is just perfect for a show, but still we think occasionally you can make it more descriptive. I would call this show Marc Maron Finds Himself in Other People.
That's a good one. I think WTF is perfect, but we're going to change what it stands for.
Okay.
And that is, what's therapy for?
With Marc Maron.
Yes.
I would say WTF is Marc Maron. So you change the W from what to who, because neither one of us knew who this guy was before this show existed and before we started listening to it. And I think most of America didn't know. And as a matter of fact, the entertainment world didn't seem to know who the heck he was until all of a sudden this podcast blew up. And now everybody wants to work with him. He's a very hot name and the TV show is doing well. And I don't think we've reached peak Marc Maron yet. Do you?
I think if people are just now being introduced to WTF through this episode, man, stop listening to the rest of this episode and go listen to some WTF.
Yeah, we've got your download. We're not worried about the rest of it anymore. I would also call this the Ed Sullivan podcast because to me, it's first of all, he came fairly early in the life of the medium.
I think that's a bit misleading. Like, if you clicked on something that said the Ed Sullivan podcast, you'd be pretty pissed off.
Oh, yeah, that it was actually this comedian named Marc Maron. It had nothing to do with the great Ed Sullivan. No, but like, if you think about it, like, Ed was kind of a crotchety, older guy, and yet he was the avenue through which this entire culture was born into people's homes. And I think a lot of people are going to be introduced to comedians, actors, to musicians, etc. through Marc Maron and through his interviews that would otherwise never have found
Yeah,
these people.
drive-by truckers for me. That's one of them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And now that might be something that becomes one of your favorite pieces of music.
And Marc Maron is a curmudgeonly old Jew.
He is indeed, and he'll be the first to tell you. The other thing that we like to do on the show is talk about favorite moments. You and I listen to the show every week, so I think it's going to be hard for us to pull one particular. We've already mentioned a couple. Gallagher walking out was a great moment. There were several moments in the Mel Brooks episode that I really, really loved. And Mel Brooks, of course, is a hero of mine, but in particular, he and Mark commiserating, memorializing, honoring, crying about the genius of Sid Caesar. There were a lot of great ones in there. Mel told a story on the podcast that I'd never heard until then, and since then I've heard it a couple more times.
I was about to say, I don't believe that. Mel
Tells
says
the same
same
stories.
8 stories. That's
Well,
it.
but this one story in
And he
particular,
tells them the exact same way.
I had never heard the story about Sid Caesar getting mad at the guy in traffic and threatening to yank him through the little fold-out window on the front of the front window. You know, there was the little one where you could flap it. Ladies and gentlemen, way back in the day before air conditioning in every car, you had the little window on the front of the front window
Yeah.
that you could open independently to get a breeze going in your vehicle. And Sid Caesar reached through that window, grabbed the guy by the collar and said, "Do you remember being born? I'm about to reenact it for you," and was going to yank him through the hole in the window before Mel Brooks talked him down. I'd never heard that story before. Since then, I've heard it a couple of times, but I was all proud of Mark for getting that story out of this guy that I hold up as a hero.
I enjoyed the Cheech and Chong episode just because when somebody says Cheech and Chong, you have a vision of your head of what that means.
Oh, sure.
But to hear about where they came from and the stuff that they did to get where they were at is crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the fact that Cheech was like a trained professional actor, or trying to be anyway,
And Chong was a musician,
whose family just happened to own a strip club,
yeah,
and it wasn't doing that well.
like he was making he was making good money, man.
These are all wonderful, wonderful stories, and Marc Maron is going to bring you stories like that every single week. So that brings us to the final part of the show where we give you a rating. I think you're already understanding that we're both pretty high on this thing. We rate these shows every week out of 2 possible earbuds. I'm going to not make it a perfect 2.0 because I don't listen to every episode. I don't. And I don't think most people will.
Okay, let me ask you a question.
I skipped the monologues.
Good. Let me ask you a question.
All right.
How many episodes of What Say You have you listened to since we reviewed it?
Of What Say You?
Have you listened to every one?
No.
And how many earbuds did you give it?
I guess I gave it 2.
Yeah, I guess you did.
See, here's what I see happening though. I look back at my ratings here, and I'm far too easy on these podcasts. I don't think that they're all 2.0s.
Yeah, and that's why I'm trying to argue with you about it.
Every week you try to argue me into the 2.0 though, and then you end up giving it like a 1.2.
No, I try to argue you down. But this week I'm trying to argue you up.
All right. I'll give it a 1.9.
That's dumb.
I'll give it a 2 then. Fine, I'll give it a 2. 2 earbuds.
You're right. It is a 2 earbud show. I agree with you.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm glad that I've got your backing.
It just is.
It really is. It's one of the best ones out there. If you don't have a problem with language, and even if you do, the language isn't like pervasive, especially if you skip the monologue like I do. In the interviews, it occasionally comes up when you've got a guest who's foul-mouthed.
Yeah, it depends on the guest.
Yeah. It really is a fantastic show, though. You can hear a tremendous amount about the history of comedy if you're a fan of comedy like I am, but also just the entertainment world in general. It's a great one. Check it out at WTFpod.com, WTFpod.com. What were you about to say?
I was about to say this is the podcast when I first started listening to shows that made me want to explore and see what else was out there.
Well, and it's one of the ones I think that made mainstream media stand up and pay attention to the medium too. Like, the New York Times started writing articles about this show in like 2011. And from there on, lots of other shows all of a sudden gained at least some level of legitimacy. Like people finally understood, oh, well, like real people can do real shows on the internet like that. Who knew? So for that, I'm glad that he blazed the trail.
Yes.
It's going to help buy us a house in Malibu someday. That's what I'm hoping anyway.
I do have an announcement for all the ladies and gentlemen out there, the guys and girls, the men and women.
The Papanalians?
Just a couple of what's coming down the pipe.
Okay.
You have to look forward to our review of Fantasy Football Focus. Will come out after the first preseason game.
Yeah, I argued if you're a fantasy guy or gal and you like to play the fantasy football, I know some of you like to draft early. I've got leagues that are already drafting now. We're gonna review ESPN's.
That's fine. That's fine.
Focus on fantasy football.
Okay, you're right. Have you listened to Fantasy Football Focus lately? They're actually taking a hiatus. They're not going to be doing it every week. So if you're drafting now, you're not going to be getting any help from them anyway.
Well, but they will start in like
the first week of preseason. You're absolutely correct.
All right, fine. So we'll be reviewing that in the upcoming weeks. We're also going to be reviewing Word Rango coming next week, as a matter of fact.
Yep.
An interesting show, a game show format. It's our first game show, actually.
And then for your fall television fix, we're going to do research and find the perfect Gotham podcast for you.
It's one of the new TV shows that you and I are most excited about. You and I each listen to a couple of these TV review shows, and we're going to be actually doing some more of those where we highlight the best podcasts for a couple of different TV shows. But we're going to start with Gotham. It's maybe the show that I'm most excited about this fall.
Me too.
That wraps things up this week. Check out more from us at podonpod.com. And a big thanks to our friends at Team ProCreate. If you haven't listened to some of the other Procasts, then check those out as well at teamprocreate.com. If you like this show, why don't you stop by in iTunes and review us, or on Stitcher? We're there as well. Give us a review that helps other people find us, just like you did. Until next week, I'm Joel.
Boomer lives!
Are you wanting something funny? Are you wanting something smart? A show on astral projection or the history of art? Do you want to learn a language or how to play guitar? Just leave it up to Joel and Josh. Pod on pod. Pod on pod.
Pod on Pod is a proud member of the Procast Network, a ProCreate production. ProCreate is a community of artists in film, music, the digital arts, and fine arts that helps connect and collaborate on projects. You can find out more at www.teamprocreate.com. For more great podcasts from the Procast Network, try Movie Buzzed. Join your host, Zach, every episode on the Movie Buzzed podcast for good friends, a good movie, and a great buzz. The Pod on Pod theme song is written and performed by Adam Dale. Find his music in iTunes and more information about him on our website. Our musical guest this week is Michael Tangent from the original video game Transcendence, The Stars of the Pilgrim, and you can find more information about them in the description.